All right, everyone, I think we'll get started in about a minute or so. We've got a large group on already, so we're delighted to see that. My name is Wayne Henry, and I'm not Michael Leslie. I'm impersonating him today. I'm the previous chair of SIETAR Florida, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here for our second in our series of bias webinars. Today, the topic is how do we avoid bias? And I'm delighted to welcome our two panelists, Elpanye K. Hudson and Sherlone McWhorter. And the topic, how do we avoid bias? What can we do to attenuate bias from a human resource management perspective? What tools and thinking are available to ensure a fair hiring process and eliminate unconscious favoritism in the workplace? So Elpanye K. Hudson is an interim vice president for human resources at Florida International University. Welcome. She oversees recruitment, development, compensation, employee relations, wellness, and equal employment. She manages two large budgets, one over $800 million for payroll and another $30 million operational budget. She's the past chair of CURE, C-U-H-R-E. Okay, maybe you can explain what that is. I'm not familiar with that organization. And she currently chairs the Greater Miami Chamber of Commerce's HR committee. So welcome, Elpanye K. Hudson. Please, please welcome our visitors.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much, Wayne, and thank you to all of you all that are in on this conversation today about this timely topic, how we avoid bias in the workplace. Really looking forward to the discussion.
You want to give a bit more information about your background?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. So as Wayne has shared, I'm currently privileged to serve here at Florida International University. And to clarify what the CURE is, that's the College and University HR Executives Consortium, which is the group of leaders from all state universities. We collaborate. That's the one place that we work together versus on the football field. We collaborate in our efforts to build wonderful employment programs for our various universities. So that's the CURE, and I'm privileged to serve here with a dynamic team of HR professionals in 12 different departments, managing the human resources for this university. I've had about 25 years in human resources and about 13 years in higher education. And it's interesting how, I came from the the public sector in municipal government and the sheriff's office and county government. And all of us, of course, grapple with the same things, and we may do things differently, but the intent is that we hire based on knowledge, skills, abilities, and the expertise that people would bring, and not be influenced by those things that would create bias and unfairness in the workplace. We're really looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you. And our second panelist is Sherlone McWhorter, and she's a highly sought after speaker. She uses the inspiring journey that took her from humble beginnings to the criminal court bench to Florida International University, where she now serves as the Director of Equal Opportunity Programs and Diversity. Sherlone is a graduate of the University of Florida College of Law. Welcome, Sherlone. Please welcome our visitors and explain a little bit more about your background.
Thank you. I am delighted to be here, and welcome to all of our guests that are here with us, and we look forward to interacting with you as you prepare your questions during our presentation. I, as you've stated, am the Director of Equal Opportunity Programs and Diversity here at FIU, where we have over 56, 57, depending upon who you ask, 1,000 students and more than 10,000 employees. I am also the Title IX coordinator here at FIU. And I've been at the university for about 10 years, also worked at the fourth largest school district in the country, and that is Miami-Dade County School Board, there as their director of equal opportunity programs and diversity. A very good the topic that we're going to be talking about today. I'm really excited about talking about unconscious bias. I grew up in the small town of Wauchula, Florida, and I'm sure most of our guests have not heard of that. It's a small town about that big, where there was very little diversity growing up. But through my travels and attending school and different things like that, certainly I've had an opportunity to interact and to work with various groups of people, which is one of the things that I really enjoy doing. And part of the job that I do here at FIU is a lot of training, and unconscious bias is one of those things that we train on. And I look forward to engaging you in the conversation today.
Fantastic. Great. So before we get started in today's topic, just remind you this is the second part of a three-part series. If you missed last week's webinar, if you can get to the SIETAR Florida Facebook page, there's a link to a recording of that. You can access that and join in that, where I'm one of the panel members, so you probably should see what it is. And then next week, I hope you can join us as well in the third and last of the series, How Do We Cope with Bias? And that's with Patricia Coleman, who's the previous president of SIETAR USA and a proud SIETAR Florida member, as well as Yuko Deneville, who is the current chair of SIETAR Florida. So don't miss that as well. So let's jump into that, and just a bit of housekeeping. There is a chat box function, if you can find that. If you've got a question during the presentation, I'm going to be trying and monitor that. So we're happy to answer the questions if you have them during the presentation, and we can try to address those. And we'll try to reserve some time at the end for questions as well. So don't be shy, and we like participation. So I think we'll turn off our videos now so we can concentrate fully on the presentation, and look forward to it. All right.
So we can proceed to the next slide. So the question is, how do we avoid bias? I think that let's try the slide right before this one. The question that we're answering is, how do we attenuate bias, and how do we, make sure that we weaken it, or we dismantle it from our processes? And I wanted to start with a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King, which says, "While it may be true that morality cannot be legislated, behavior can be regulated. It may be true that the law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. It may be true that the law cannot make a man love me, but it can keep him from lynching me." And I think that's pretty important also. And that particular quote from Dr. King really is the impetus for the civil rights legislation, the Civil Rights Act, and things that impacted employment law, as well as unfair labor practices that were occurring at that time. And so it's important that we're knowledgeable about the history and how we got here and what we can do to attenuate and avoid bias. And so, as your screen says, we have to do it on purpose. We have to be intentional about making sure that we, as HR professionals, directly and intentionally approach the subject. And I would encourage you, as Wayne has indicated, to visit the first seminar. It's very important to hear that foundation about the topic of bias in terms of defining it and what it actually is. And when I consider my own career and I take a panoramic view of how things have changed, I'm inspired by the achievements that have been gained and recognized. But I recognize also that there's still work to do. I understand that, when we are engaging the population, we're looking for talent, we're looking for top talent. We are, you're treading on that fine line to make sure that you have diversity and make sure that you're not being exclusive of talent that needs to come through your organization. So HR leaders have to be intentional. We have to make sure that we infuse in the process ways that we make sure that we ensure that we are inclusive in the applicant pools that we're inviting for positions. And then, you have the theory that if you're reviewing salaries of, for instance, in an application, if you're looking at when a person graduated from college, you might subconsciously say, oh, well, they may be too young or they may be too old. So consider removing those things from consideration so it does not influence your decision when you're trying to hire top talent. So it's an opportunity to be intentional about how you are recruiting, how you are reaching out, how you're casting your net wide to bring candidates to your applicant pool. And if you're privileged to manage human resources, be purposeful and be proactive even in the workplace. Make sure that you avoid bias in your promotion opportunities, avoid bias in your distribution of bonuses and such. And it's important that you pay very, very close attention to your practices. And when Sherlon speaks, she will certainly share some tools that you can use to make sure that you do avoid bias in those situations. Next slide. The next slide, please. So you want to speak to, thank you, addressing the unaware. Oftentimes there are leaders that are in position that simply do not know. They simply are not aware of practices that they may employ or behaviors that they may emanate that are reflective of bias. And so it's important that leaders are constantly being developed, constantly engaging in professional development exposure opportunities that allows them to see and to hear and to know what's trending, what types of behaviors are we emanating that may or may not be, that may be demonstrating bias. So we want to address the unaware. We want to be curious about our behaviors, be curious about our practices. When you see trends, as you're looking and you're hiring in certain units, if you're seeing all women, or you're seeing all Hispanics, or you're seeing all of anything, pay attention to your own practices. How are you engaging? How are you going about identifying the talent, for what's necessary? You want to make sure that you keep in front of you the metrics that are demonstrating what your composition looks like. Move away from the things that imply personal choice and the the just like me type of behavior. I want this person, I happen to be loud and gregarious. If a person is passive, then I might be standoffish. That might be something that I've put in my mind, that a passive or quiet person is not able to effectively do this work. So pay attention to be aware and genuinely curious about what your own practices are, and ensure that you are getting the training that you need as HR leaders to go out of your way and make sure that that the practices that you're employing are consistent with hiring for the best talent, the knowledge, the skills, and the abilities that are available to you. And then the next slide. And this simply says, as you are reviewing your practices, as you are looking at the composition of your workforce, as you are seeing trends, maybe you're seeing turnover trends, you're seeing things. If you see something, do something about it. Be aware as a leader in HR particularly, especially as it relates to promotions. Who's being promoted frequently, and who are you pouring into? Who are you developing? And there is a fine line, because you want to create a succession plan. So you want to look for your high potentials that are in your space, in your workforce. You want to look at that. But then, pay attention to trends that may be appearing, right? Because perception is important. It's reality. You want to make sure that you are of casting that net wide. You're giving everyone opportunity to move into those places of leadership, move into those promoted places. Who are you extending the stretch assignments to? Be intentional and create a degree of methodology so that should you ever be challenged, in an area of why is it this or that, you're able to provide a solid justification for why these individuals or why this group or why this particular population has been invited to participate in this development opportunity versus another. And it's a wonderful opportunity to develop all your talent, right? When you see opportunities to speak to areas of growth or development, you do that across the board, and everyone has opportunity to grow. And certainly those that are more interested in the growth opportunity, they're going to do the things that are going to require or that would be more helpful in moving them forward to that. So you want to make sure that you are equitable in your providing opportunities for your current workforce and those that are working with you, and pay attention to the trends. When you see something that's growing and appearing to provide a perception that's not favorable, do something about it. Take ownership in correcting yourself, self-correction and self-reflection to make sure that you are not creating an environment of bias. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Sherlon to speak further about the tools and thinking that's available to ensure that fair hiring practices are in place.
Again, I'm delighted to be here with you talking about such a timely topic in terms of all the different things that are going on in HR and certainly those things that are going on around us in our everyday lives. At this point, I'd like to talk to you about the impact of unconscious bias in the workplace. Certainly, and you can imagine the areas that our biases will impact. One of the things that we are dealing with right now is diversity and inclusion are buzzwords. Most universities, most HR departments, whether corporate or non-corporate, will have a diversity office. You will have trainings on diversity and inclusion, which is very important. But I recently was looking at something that actually listening to a webinar, and a person was doing a speech and she was talking about diversity and inclusion. She indicated that diversity is an invitation to the party and inclusion is an invitation to dance at the party. And so while we want to invite people to sit in the seat and come to the party, we certainly want to make sure that we're being inclusive so that those same people will have an opportunity to dance at the party. And so when we talk about diversity and inclusion, those are things that, we want to remember because it's not enough for us to just invite and to recruit persons to be a part of our organization, but also to help them to feel good about being there in the positions that they're in. So when we talk about recruitment, we're talking about hiring decisions, interviews, promotions, all of the things that you see here. When we talk about these sorts of things, it's important that the person feels that they have been invited to dance at the party. You recruited me, and through your recruitment process, you looked at all the things that you needed to do. You looked at those things that could be construed as bias, and you've considered those things. But now that you've made the hiring decision, do I feel included? Are you doing things to make those persons that are different included? We look at this when we talk about interviews, promotions, job assignments. Are you assigning those people, as Alpanya mentioned earlier, the people who look more like you, the people who are part of an affinity group that you may be a part of? We all graduated from the same university. When we talk about pay increases, we have to look at it from that perspective. How do you do that? You do that by looking at data. You do that by running numbers. So you want to make sure that sometimes these unconscious bias, there's a reason they call it unconscious bias. And that's because it's not something that we consciously set out to do. It's not something that we knowingly do. It's something that we unconsciously do. So when we're talking about performance reviews, you're doing your PEPs, your performance evaluations, and you compare and look at others' evaluations. And are you treating people the same based on the same criteria? Are you judging everyone by the same criteria? When we're looking at training, you say, well, how does this come into play with training in HR? Well, are you inviting certain people to go to training? Are you paying for different groups to go to training more so than other groups of people? Those people that you're closest to, do they get to go to training outside of your workplace? And the people who you're not so close to, they just get to do online training? Those kinds of things, because we want to provide equal opportunity to the people who work for us. Mentoring. We want to make sure that we're providing mentoring equally to the people who work with us. The impact of unconscious bias in the workplace can be horrendous if we're not looking at all of these different areas to make sure that we're being fair. Because when we talk about unconscious bias, one of the things I'd like to say to you is at this point is that you experience, you share unconscious bias on a daily basis. And guess what? I do too. Unconscious bias is something that we all have in common. There are a lot of things about us that are different, but there are a lot of things about us that are the same, and unconscious bias is one of those things that we share. It is something that we all have, and we must know that, we must recognize that, and not be ashamed of it. I think that's really important, that we recognize we have it and we're not ashamed of it. When we talk about the risk of unconscious bias in the workplace can certainly cause negative consequences. According to the EEOC, the office that does these investigations based on discrimination. And what the EEOC does is they investigate cases based on protected categories. Those protected categories are areas such as race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, pregnancy, disability, veteran status, all of those kinds of things. But the EEOC is saying that many times, oftentimes, what they're seeing is this unconscious behavior that started out in the workplace as unconscious bias ends up in their office looking like discrimination. And so that's why it is so important for each one of us to examine ourselves, to examine our workplaces, to examine the people that we work with, and look at the risk of our behavior and determine, is this behavior, or is this unconscious bias, or is this conscious bias? And let's deal with it. Because one of the things that happens is unconscious bias is not one of those things that, again, that we're aware of. So when we're talking about discriminatory treatment or practices that we have, negative business culture, that's really, really important. When you look at the culture of your workplace, how do we, and where you work, are you looking at it from a cultural perspective? Are you using your cultural lens to determine if you're being fair to people, if you're treating people fairly? And one of the things that you can always consider is look at the diversity in your department, look at the diversity in your university, look at the diversity in your workplace. And if there's a lack of diversity in any area, that may be, and the key word is maybe, that may be as a result of some unconscious bias. Think about that. You know, discriminatory treatment and practices, negative business culture. What is a culture like where you work? And then let's look at the lack of diversity in your workplace. And when you think about that, when you look at it closely and you examine it, you may be able to determine some of those things that were otherwise unconscious, they may become conscious. So certainly you want to consider and to think of those kinds of things as you seek to lessen the impact. I must give you a warning, and that warning is unconscious bias is never going to go away. There will always be unconscious bias in the world as long as there are people in the world, because it's human nature. It is our way, our brain, our mind's way of forming shortcuts so that we don't have to figure all of these things out one by one, because we have millions of thoughts a day. And so our unconscious mind, our unconscious biases come from that. And so what we seek to do is to lessen the impact of our unconscious bias. We seek to do that in different ways. And as we go through this, we will look at some of those things that we want to consider when we're talking about the risk of unconscious bias, and remembering what the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, says, is that a lot of this unconscious bias is rampant in our workplace, and sometimes it can result in discrimination. So certainly keep that in on the forefront of your mind. I mentioned this before, you're biased and so am I. If you look at the picture here, we have a diverse group of people. This is what we want the workplace to look like. Why is that? We want the workplace to look like this picture, where you have diverse groups of people. You have a person there in a wheelchair. You have people of different color, people of different nationalities. What do they bring to the table? They all bring something different, and not just in those obvious things that we can see, not just in the fact that our color is different, not just in the fact that we come from different places in the world, but we bring different thoughts, different ways of thinking, different ways of figuring out issues and problems and dealing with those things. So diversity matters. You're biased and so am I. However, as I like to say, there's no shame in having biases. You shouldn't feel bad about it. The only shame is making no effort to improve it. So we're going to have these biases. They will come up. And I'll share with you, at some point, I realized a bias that I had. And you realize that right now we have at least 4 generations in the workplace. And this is probably the first time in history that we've had 4 different generations in the workplace. And why is that? Because people are working longer. People are working longer. Why is that? Because they choose to work longer, because they're living longer. People may be working longer because they need to work longer because of the economy. People may be working longer because they have elderly parents to attend to. There are various reasons that people choose to work longer, but if they're in the workplace, we want to learn to get along, to deal with each other in the workplace, and to make sure that we create an environment that's conducive for learning, that's conducive for growth. And again, you're biased and so am I, and the shame is only in not making an effort to improve our biases, to make sure that we are doing what we need to do when we talk about hiring, that we're not looking at an application and saying, oh, based on this person's experience, they must have been in a workplace for a very long time. And I can tell this not because they took their age, they didn't take the age from the application, but I can tell this by the number of jobs that they put on the application. I can tell this by the fact that they listed their jobs and they put the years they were at each place. It's basic math. So sometimes when people say, well, they didn't put their age on there, I didn't know. Did you really not know? You may say, oh, I didn't know that Sherlon, it has her name on there, but that could be black or white. I'm not sure. I didn't know that how could I know that I was being biased? I just looked at the application. I didn't know where she was from. Well, my undergraduate degree, while I went to law school at the University of Florida, my undergraduate degree is at Bethune-Cookman University. So somebody may be able to determine, oh, that is an HBCU. That is a predominantly African-American school. So you may be able to glean from that. It's those kinds of things that you want to look at, that you want to make sure that you're paying attention to, so that you can spot and identify the unconscious biases that we're talking about. Because when we think about it, studies have shown that when we think about ourselves, when we look at ourselves, when we examine ourselves, we don't see these biases. We don't see them. And we want to be able to recognize them even though we don't initially see them. So we want you to do the deep dive and to be able to, to think about that and to be able to look at yourself and to make those kinds of decisions. So some strategies for the workplace. Let's talk a little bit about that. And, certainly if you have questions, please post your questions so that we can deal with them. And I don't mind, stopping at any point to talk about any strategies that you'd like to talk about and any questions that you have. But the first strategy for me is open conversation. And this open conversation, from my perspective, begins with you. It begins with you, not your colleagues, not your coworkers, but it begins with you. You need to have a conversation with yourself. who you are, where you're from, why you do things the way that you do them. Think about that. Excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold, so I'm drinking water here. But think about the open conversation that you should have with yourself. Think about, where are you from? How do they do it where you're from? Maybe they do it like this where you're from, but they don't do it like that where I'm from. And so because we're from different places, from different worlds, because we grew up in different parts of the country, that diversity is wonderful, but that diversity also can bring about challenges. And so we want you to have open dialogue with yourself. And once you've had that open dialogue and you examine yourself, then we can begin to look at others around us. Look at those coworkers that we work with every day. Identify the issues, identify problems, and acknowledge them when you see them. And then we have listed here interrupters. Let me tell you what some interrupters are. You're in a search and screen committee. You're on the committee. You've been chosen to help with the hiring process. And I'm going to talk about this from a higher ed perspective, since that's what I do every day. So we're involved in a search and screen, and we're going to be hiring a faculty member. And you're in the middle of this search. And your coworker, you're sitting there, you're examining the resumes, and your coworker says something about, oh, I'm not sure about Sherlon McWhorter. She looks like a good candidate, but I'm not sure she's a good fit. That's a good time for you to act as an interrupter. That's a good time for you to interrupt that chain of conversation, because another coworker may jump right in and say, I think you're right, because the people in that area, they need somebody that can do this or can do that, right? So you may interrupt and you say, well, I'm not quite sure what you mean by fit. Can you explain that? Can you expound on that a little bit more? So you do that. And at that point, your colleague will realize that that might not have been something good to say. That may not be something that we want to talk about in this interview, because what we want to do is to look at that job description. We want to look at the qualifications of that position and talk about those kinds of things. Make those things the main thing rather than good fit. Because when you start talking about that, that is usually a buzzword for us. We also want you to be intentional. Be intentional about the things that you discuss. And if you're being intentional, you can avoid some of the biases that will come up. Be intentional in terms of the job description. Be intentional in terms of the questions that you're going to ask. Those are strategies, just a few strategies that you can use in the workplace that will help you to identify and acknowledge some of the biases that will come up that you don't realize. One of the things that happened to me once, I was in a job interview. I was the director of the program that I was working with at the time. And I had a coworker who was there who actually worked for me. And we were interviewing a candidate. The both of us were of African-American descent, both people of color. And the person that we were interviewing was not. My complexion, dark, the other person, light complexion. And as we sat there, and remember, we're talking about unconscious bias. The person that we were interviewing, no matter who asked questions, she would look at the other person. She never looked at me. And when I was analyzing what I thought was happening, and I may be totally off, but as I'm analyzing what was happening here, I noticed she never made eye contact with me, even when I attempted to make eye contact with her. And when I asked the question, she would always respond to the other person who looked more like her. Now, this woman came for the job interview, so I'm sure that she wanted the job. And I'm sure she was there to impress upon us the fact that she wanted the job. But she wasn't doing a very good job at that because she never made eye contact with the hiring official, who was me. And I'm sure that was unconscious behavior. And so just as candidates will often exhibit that type of behavior, as persons who are conducting interviews, we may do the same thing. So we want to be careful. We want to make sure that we are examining ourselves as well when we look at these strategies. When we talk about interviewing and hiring procedures, which is really important in the workplace, the interview is probably more susceptible to unconscious bias as much as any other part of the hiring process. Because when you start interviewing, that's when you interject who you are. That's when you interject where you've lived, where you from, where you were born, what your experiences have been. So one of the things that we want to do so that we can minimize these types of things is to have structured interviews. What are you doing in your workplace? Your interviews, how do you do them? Are they structured? Do you have standard interview questions? Are there diverse interview panels? Those are things for you to consider and think about. The top 3 on this list: structured interviews, standard interview questions, and diverse interview panels. If you are not doing that at a minimum, I suggest to you, if you do that, that will make a world of a difference. Because the idea is the people that you're interviewing, not only are you interviewing them, but they're interviewing you. And if I am an excellent candidate, believe me, you are going to want to hire me. But I am looking at you to determine how your university, what your corporate, what you're doing in your workplace. Are you inclusive? Are you diverse? Is there diversity there? And so have structured interviews. You want to have an interview panel. Here at FIU, we do search and screens, and we have a diverse group that will look at the applications that will be a part of this interview process. They have standard questions that are written out so that people are not shooting from the hip. When you shoot from the hip, that's when you're more likely to see and experience unconscious bias. But if you had time and taken the time to write out interview questions based on the job description, you're less likely to exhibit those negative types of behavior. If it's a structured interview and you have those interview questions, reevaluate. I can't say that enough. Reevaluate your processes. What are you doing when it comes to interviewing and hiring? What do your procedures look like? When is the last time you looked at them? Do maybe you talk to some people, some focus groups, and determine, is this working? What do you think about this? Talk to some people who have recently, maybe some internal candidates who've gone through your interview process. Reevaluate your process and call others out on their biases. We talked about that a little bit earlier as an interrupter, to call people out on their biases in obviously a very professional manner. You will call them out. You'll talk about it. These are the things that you should do. Make sure at a minimum that you're doing these things, because they will make a world of a difference. That is briefly what I have for you. Certainly, if you have any questions, any comments, we are open for questions and comments. We want to make certain that it is imperative that if you are in HR, because we're talking about unconscious bias in HR, if you are an HR professional, certainly you want to take the steps that are necessary to eliminate, or certainly, if you can't eliminate, to minimize the efforts, the effect of unconscious bias on human resources and your decision making. It's imperative that you do that because your efforts will be in vain if you're not doing these kinds of things. You'll look up and find yourself working hard, and you'll wonder, why are we not diverse? Why are we not inclusive? Why did that candidate choose to go to another school rather than our school, to another workplace than our workplace? You have to stop. You have to acknowledge. You have to make informed decisions so that you will be able to hire the best candidates for the job, so that you will have a diverse group of people working. Because the facts show, the stats show, the more diverse we are, the better workplace we're going to have. Managing unconscious bias is a vital step in building workplaces that are innovative, that are dynamic and inclusive. And I know that those are the kinds of workplaces that we want to have. So I'm not sure if there's any questions or any comments at this time. Certainly we're willing to answer any questions at this time.
Yeah, so if anyone wants to put a question in the chat box, or if they want something they can share, we can actually give you the power to voice that to the group as well. So feel free to be a part of the conversation or ask a question. We'd be delighted. So Patricia Coleman raised her hand. Okay. Patricia, do you want to, we can give you ability to talk to the group if you want. Let's see. Okay, Patricia, you can, I think you've got the ability to talk if you want to. So I can type my question, or you can talk. Oh, Q&A.
So Santiago,
We've got one open question. It says from Santiago. Seems like it would be good to review job descriptions to see if they are accurate and specific.
This is El Panier, and it's always good to review your job descriptions, accurate, specific, and up to date. Oftentimes, employees would have been working for a length of time, and maybe their job has evolved or changed in some fashion. And so that's certainly a time to make sure that you are keeping them up to date. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd like to expound on that. That's really important, as well as when you're hiring, to look at those job descriptions from the perspective of the things that you're requiring. Are they absolutely necessary as a part of that job? Sometimes there are things that are required, and what we like to do, what the phrase we like to use here is we want to cast the net wide. And so if you have a job description that does not cast the net wide, there's only a small group of people that will qualify based on those criteria that you have listed. You may want to consider those things as well, because certainly you want diverse groups of people to apply for your job. And if you make it so strict and constraining, that may not be the case. So you want to certainly make sure you get qualified people who can do the job, but make sure the job description reflect the job that you're seeking a person to do.
I might share, when I was working in the UK, they were very robust in our procedures that we had to follow. So for example, if we posted a job description, we had to have a documented scoring sheet, and those scores for every applicant had to be recorded, and they must.
Wayne, I think you're breaking up. We can't hear you. Wayne, are you there? Apanya, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can hear you.
Yeah, I'm not sure. We can't hear Wayne. Are you able to see the questions? Or are there other questions? Because we can't hear from Wayne.
There's not another question. I do recall his example concerning a position that he posted. And one of the requirements of that job was that you be able to live and work in a particular location. And a candidate, an applicant, applied for the job and was successful in securing that job. And then it turned out when they were ready to start the job, the woman said, I can't work or live in that location. And of course, the offer had to be rescinded. And she filed a complaint because she felt like she was being discriminated against. But back to the job description and the posting announcement, the requirements of the job were very, very clear. In that case, they were restrictive because there was a need for that. And so they were justified in making that termination because the employee could not fulfill the functions of that job. So these are things as we are leading in HR arenas have to be mindful to make sure, as Sherlon pointed out, that your position description, that your job announcement is reflective of the work that needs to be done, and that's a defensible position to be in.
Yes, very important. And I think that while we're talking, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the when we're doing hiring and we're doing interviewing is the importance of having diverse groups of people on those committees, because we all bring something different to the table. And oftentimes what will happen is if you do not have diversity at your workplace, then the question becomes, well, how do I have a diverse committee? Interview people that are going to do the interviewing because I don't have diversity in my job in the workplace. Well, we would suggest it makes such a big difference that it is so important that you diversify that committee. So maybe you cross the line, you go over to a different department and invite some persons who may be from different backgrounds to sit on your committee. Because remember, people will often say they look at the subject matter. We're going to hire a professor and we say, well, they're going to teach English, so we need all English teachers. Well, that's not true, because the person, while they are going to teach English, there are lots of other things that are important about their job skills and about their abilities. And so there are other people who may not be an English teacher who could serve on that committee. And that's really, really important. Some of the creative things that we do here at Florida International University is we will often, if we need to bring people from other departments, or we will maybe have a PhD student who brings diversity to that committee to serve. And so be creative in the things that you do so that you can get the results that you need to get.
Very good. Charlene, here's a question, and I'd like for you to speak to this. The writer says, my name is Patricia. I do not go by Pat, but I was told once to write Pat, to be neutral on paper until my experience raises interest. What do you think?
I don't know if I'm the best person to ask that question because I think, Patricia, if your name is Patricia, you should write Patricia. And, granted, I guess they're assuming that people will think that you're Pat, that may be a man rather than a woman. You are Patricia. You are who you are. And as for me, I am who I am. And when I go in for that job interview, you're going to know who I am. When they look at, to be honest, it's so important that we all try to get this right. And this is why we do these trainings, because of the biases, some conscious and some unconscious, right? Mm-hmm. But if you are going to hire Pat because you think Pat's a man and not because she's a woman, Pat, I don't know that you want that job anyway.
Right.
We want people to do the right thing for the right reason. And I want you to be able to be who you are. And we do these trainings because we're trying to catch those people that are out there that would make a difference too, that they will become conscious of those behaviors and stop that behavior. And once I was at the University of Florida when I was in law school there, and a young man, we had a debate and they were talking about biases. And the young man said that, well, there's one thing about being African-American. And people were like, he said, you go for a job interview and they're going to know that you're Black because they can see Black a mile away. Mm-hmm. And we all laughed. But there's some truth about that. You're a woman. They can see that a mile away. And if there's certain things about our resumes that people, if they really want to know, they will be able to tell. With the internet now, people can tell who we are. So I say, be true to who you are. Stand up in your truth every day and accept what you have to accept.
Absolutely. That's excellent. And she went on to say, Patricia is a woman's name and can be perceived as Hispanic. Some see it as a handicap to high-level public speaking engagements. And I seek about international business where white American males are viewed as leaders, yet I have 30 years of experience. And I concur wholeheartedly with Charlone's response, because at the end of the day, if they're looking, or anyone is looking at that and trying to make a decision, you want that speaks to that organizational culture. And you want to make sure that you are bringing who you are to that organization, because we are sufficient. We are experts in our fields and we bring that with us. And so if that's the determinant, then you want to bring who you are to that workplace. So thank you, Charlene. It was an excellent response. Looking to see if there are any more questions that have come in. Here's another question. I have a thought around the strategy you shared, Charlene, for the recruiting process, which is really interesting. My thought as an intercultural trainer who works with different countries, I was wondering if it would apply everywhere, every state and in every country, even if that would be the ideal situation. Indeed, depending on the status in the USA, diversity is different and thus might have a different approach. For example, in Japan, where I come from, I have heard recently that it is common to refuse a job to a non-Japanese who totally fits the job description. The HR manager may ask directly, as an American, what will be your added value? Why should I hire you instead of a local person? And that's pretty loaded. And of course, we speak through the lens of our country's laws in terms of how to remove biases and such. But Sherlon, would you have an opinion there?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of what you said.
I said, would you have an opinion there?
Yeah, that's, again, I think that you answered in terms of, certainly there are different cultures, different places where things are done differently. But again, that question, I'll just, talk about this part of it where they say, what would you add? And, to look at that part of it, think about it. That happens all the time in lots of places, in most places. That's what we're looking for. What is it that you're going to add? Here, there are certain positions that we give veterans preference, right? Because of the laws in the United States of America. Now, there's specifics in terms of what jobs, what types of jobs, and those kinds of things. But there are preferences that are sometimes given, and you don't automatically get the job, but you get points. And so what we would be asking is, of any candidate, what do you bring to the table? What is it about you? Why should I hire you? What is it that you're going to add to this position? And so when we go to an interview, we should always be answering that question, whether they're asking it or not, so that we can put ourselves and our behaviors, the talents that we have and that we bring to the table, that we're shining a light on them so that people can see. But it certainly is. I can appreciate your question, and it is different. And so some of these things is not going to apply. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Sherlon. I don't see any additional questions. Wait, let's see here. I don't see additional questions. And I want to say thank you all for joining us this afternoon in this conversation. We want to thank our moderator, Wayne Henry, and we will certainly catch up with him. And I'm sure
I think there he is. There's Wayne.
I'm back. Sorry, my computer froze. I was scared it may have ended the whole webinar. I was really hoping.
No, we've been going on.
We carried on.
Right.
Wayne, I was about to make your closing remarks to invite others to join us on November 8th for the third in the series, How Do We Cope with Bias? And I would encourage you all to go back and look at the first one from October 25th, What Bias Is, and then join us on November 8th with How Do We Cope with Bias? And Wayne, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, and I have some closing remarks as well, Wayne, whenever you're ready.
Oh, yep. Do that, Sherlon, please.
Yeah, so one of the things, again, thank you all for being here. I appreciate your attention and your listening, and certainly, hopefully, you got something from this. In closing, we want to encourage you to certainly look for your own biases and to make sure that you are working to identify them where you can. We realize that we'll never be totally rid of unconscious bias, but we certainly want to deal with it where we can and make a difference and to minimize it. Always remember, if you look for talent in the same places, the same schools, using the same referrals, you're going to get the same kinds of candidates. So difference is good. Additionally, if you're hiring teams of people and it doesn't have a diverse representation of candidates, it will be difficult to look for and see diversity in your slate. You want to make sure that you're casting that net wide from a HR perspective, that you're always casting the net wide, that you're always being not just looking at diversity, but also being inclusive. Really, really important. Because remember, diversity is inviting me to the party, and inclusion is allowing me to dance at the party. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Sherlon. Let me say, too, from a management and leadership perspective, I encourage you to lead by example. As leaders, check yourselves and self-correct, and then impart into others, develop others such that they begin to view from a larger and a wider lens, recognizing the value that diversity brings, value in thought, diversity in ideas, creativity. All of those things serve to make our organizations better. And that's why FIU is such a great place to work, because we're intentional about our efforts to be inclusive, to invite you not just to the party, but to invite you to dance. And so we really, really hope that you've gotten something from today's presentation, and we've really enjoyed serving you.
Well, thank you both. I personally enjoyed it tremendously and learned a lot. And thank you for sharing and taking your time out to provide some spectacular information for our visitors. For those that joined in, thank you for joining us. I know that you've learned a lot as well, and give a great thanks to our panelists. Please do join us again next week for our third in the series. That's going to be how do we cope with bias, and that's going to be Patricia, Yuko, and Evelyn, who I forgot to mention earlier, Evelyn. So it's a fantastic panel, definitely to be entertaining as well as informative. Please join us there and spread the news about it. Go to our SIETAR Florida Facebook page to get the link to register and get your link to join us. And we look forward to seeing you next week.